Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. It is Femme Friday, August 6th. This is going to be a little bit of a special show for many reasons. I am, as many of you know who've been watching, I am in Greece right now, and we are engulfed. And when I say engulfed, I am not overstating that. That is not just rhetoric. We are engulfed in flames. In the background right now, every couple of seconds, you may see me turn my head to watch the television because there are over 100 wildfires that have spread across the country of Greece. It's said to be near 150 around Athens. There are wildfires, and the country is not equipped to deal with these wildfires. A few years ago, I actually found myself in the middle of one of the most historic and tragic wildfires that existed in Mati, Greece. I was driving back from Albania, where part of my family is from, in southern Albania. And I was driving back, and I was supposed to take off on a plane into Athens, and the road cut off, and I had no idea what was going on. No one knew what was going on. It wasn't just a language issue. I did not understand why this major highway was cut off, and there were firefighters all around me, and they were telling me to go in one direction, and the direction that I was looking at was towards the fire, which made no sense to me. And so my instincts told me to go in the other direction. And I went off on some side streets into a seaside village. And I tried to find, I stayed somewhere to grab some food. And I learned that the road was going to be cut off at least until the next morning. And of course, I missed my flight. We had no idea how tragic that fire was. I had no idea how much in danger, how it was just a few feet away from being in danger. I had food that night. I could not find a hotel room. I ended up staying in my car, sleeping on the edge of the road, right up against the water on the beach that night, hardly able to sleep, not understanding what was happening, seeing the fire in the near distance, and then learning the next day that many people did exactly what I did, escaping their homes and going into the water, sleeping on the beach. But because of the way that the smoke was flowing, they did not survive because the smoke is so overwhelming. Now there are hundreds of these situations happening around Greece. On Monday, Greece had the highest temperature on record at 115 degrees. The winds are blowing all over, and the footage that we're watching it's like the apocalypse before our eyes. This is not just Greece. It's happening in Italy. It's happening in Turkey. It's happening across the Mediterranean right now. But the number of fires that are occurring in Greece right now are historic and possibly the worst in global history. I'm incredibly emotional because I have been watching this footage, and I've seen reporters courageously following the fires, not understanding, just as I didn't understand as a driver, and as the firefighters did not understand in 2018, how extraordinary those events were and how many lives would be lost. We have no sense right now how many lives are lost, but what I do have a sense of is just the lack of support and lack of infrastructure. And the stories that came out in 2018, and there was a leftist government, Syriza was in power. And what was later uncovered was that because of austerity, the fire departments were mainly volunteer, and they were not doing the controlled burns that they had been doing for years and years and years. And austerity had forced them to cut back on those controlled burns. And then just a year later, the right-wing government, the right-wing party, the coalition party that came forth, and the right-wing media put out a documentary and put out massive smear campaigns blaming essentially the massacre of hundreds of people who had died in those fires in Mati on the Syriza government, when the Syriza government had not had any role in the austerity. And if anything, they fought it. They fought the austerity that was imposed on them, in which basic governance was not able to occur. And so the fires spread more rapidly. And what we're seeing right now on air, as reporters are discussing this, as reporters in the studios, hosts in the studios are talking about it, is they'll say that some of the locations that have pine trees, the pine cones will explode and they'll fly hundreds of feet away. And then another fire will pop up and it'll hit a home. And in a minute, that home will be engulfed in flames. I saw multiple people at this point on air, as I've been watching this all day. Multiple people went in to try to hose off their properties and the trees around them, thinking that by making sure that their property was wet, their homes were wet, the trees were wet, the fire would not take over. But it's happening too quickly. The wind is too strong. And especially in these areas where there haven't been control burns, it's just happening at a more rapid pace. Of course, record heat, winds, and austerity that has prevented control burns is creating this extraordinary crisis. And guess what the right-wing government is doing right now? Mitsotakis, the prime minister of Greece, has been caught in a scandal hiding millions and millions of dollars in offshore accounts and in offshore real estate with his wife. He has been escaping the press, even though the majority of the press in Greece is right-wing. What has he been doing? He's been vacationing in Crete as the prime minister. The campaign that he led against Tsipras, Prime Minister Tsipras, who, by the way, is out at the fires right now. The campaign he led against Tsipras, saying that he was not, that he was responsible for the fires. Mitsotakis is now vacationing. He's away. This is the largest crisis Greece has ever faced, possibly the entire Mediterranean, possibly even the entire EU when it comes to wildfires. And I'm not entirely sure. I think it's too early to tell. Possibly the globe. There are too many fires that are taking place, too many communities, too many villages, and folks don't know where to go. They have no sense. Many European countries have sent in firefighters to assist. And just to add to this, we in Athens right now, where I am, we're under lockdown. We are being asked not to leave our homes because of the ashes, because of the air quality, because of the heat. Also, potentially because we don't want to put anybody at risk. One cigarette can light up an entire forest. And there are many, many trees and forests, even in the Athens vicinity, because in northern Athens right now, they are engulfed in flames. And of course, that's leading to the energy crisis. So I'm asking for your patience on this show today. We've been dealing with a lot in the last few weeks since we've been here because of the heat. I think Americans in particular more recently understand that when it's hotter, air conditionings are on and the power can be put, it can be weakened. And as a result, Wi-Fi and internet can be very slow or set off. So if we have any glitches today, we might actually end up taking my video off and our guest video off. So please be patient with us. Very, very grateful to you for understanding. But these are extraordinary times. And, I just the other day we talked about the fall of Rome. Here we are in Athens, the birthplace of modern day democracy, Western civilization, and we're watching Greece burn, Rome burn, Greece burn. And I can't help but constantly think, where's our government? Why are we having fights over climate change, whether it exists? Why are we even doing that? Why are we even doing that? We know, what is this? We are in the midst of the end of civilization. And if we actually do care about humanity, if we do care, it doesn't make any sense to me at this point. It doesn't make any sense. There have to be emergency actions need to be taking place. I mean, I started with austerity because when you find out that austerity is what led to this, because they weren't able to do controlled burns, because the money that was put into the public fire department was taken out and it's all volunteer or mostly volunteer, that's ridiculous. We know the science. We know that when you have controlled burns, it prevents more wildfires from occurring. We know that in the States. We know that worldwide. But instead, these oligarchs want to completely starve these countries from survival, starve working people, starve the conditions And they also simultaneously don't want to pay taxes. But guess what? These people have villas also. And sure, they might have great insurance, but when a fire comes in 5 minutes and puts your house at risk and your lives at risk, what are you going to do? Are you going to regret this? I'd like to hear a few billionaires who lost their homes in these fires. I'd like to hear them stand up and say, you know what? I was wrong. Because I'm going to tell you, climate change is a danger to everybody. Yes, if you have more money, you are more protected for sure. But when a fire ravages your community in a minute and you have no time to escape, but to grab your most important belongings, possibly grab your most important belongings, but you get in the car and you don't know which direction to go because there's fires all around you. And the smoke is so thick, they don't even know where the fires are coming from right now. They can't see the sunlight. That is what the reporter said. She says, I don't know where to go. The reporter said that. One man knew that his neighbor was still in his home and he ran into the man's home. And I don't know if this man's alive still or if his neighbor was alive or survived and was yelling, Alexandros, where are you? Meanwhile, dozens of people said that they left men in particular were saying that their children, their families escaped and they're hosing down their homes trying to protect their life savings. This is already a country that has been put under a tremendous austerity, where the working class has been suffering, where the minimum wage right now is extremely low. And you're lucky as a working person, especially if you're under the age of 40 and you're overeducated. Most of them have degrees and master's degrees, and they're lucky if they're making 400 euros a month. Lucky. That's senior management. So if they have a home or if they inherited a home from their family in the country, and now it's being burned, that's all they have. Austerity is what led to this. Austerity. Greece is just an example of what is happening in Spain and in Italy and in Portugal and in Puerto Rico and in Venezuela and in Argentina and in Louisiana and in Detroit and in New York. It is happening everywhere. So we can sit here and fight online over who's the biggest leftist, or debate procedural issues at DSA conventions, or we can actually step up in solidarity and say, enough. And that is what Cori Bush did this week. Congressman Cori Bush said, enough. I am standing on the steps of the Capitol and I am fighting off any delays in an eviction moratorium because there's too much at risk. Incrementalism is killing people. Austerity is killing people. Our government is so beholden to the interests that have put them in power, and they're so conditioned by the playbook of the last 40 years of neoliberalism that they don't know how to respond in a time of extraordinary crisis when literally an entire country is on fire. You have a lawmaker, a prime minister who labels himself as center-right and who folks in the United States think is center-left. He's on vacation in Crete with his shirt off. How out of touch are you? How out of touch are you? Ted Cruz flying to Cancun. Joe Biden even sitting and pausing to think about whether or not to extend the eviction moratorium is out of touch. Kamala Harris going to Guatemala and saying, stay here. Stay where? Your families are at risk. If they can't survive because of the economy, they can't survive because of the crime. And they're risking their lives and whatever savings they have and potentially whatever loans that they're going to be paying off in the next several decades to come to the border and potentially be put into camps. And Kamala Harris has the nerve to say, stay here, while she's on stage with a fascist. This is the state of our political system. And let me tell you, no fights online are going to solve this. What Cori Bush did, first, she ran multiple times, despite what anybody told her. She raised that money on her own. She organized on her own. She did not give up. She did not stand down. Her car was shot at. She was unhoused. She had COVID twice. Her car was repossessed after her race before this one a couple of years ago. And she still did not give up. And then when she got to Capitol Hill, this is only a year after she was elected. Yesterday, she won her primary 1 year ago yesterday. What did she do? She sat on the steps of Capitol Hill to make sure that Joe Biden could hear and could feel. And she invited others. And really, where were the rest of the congressional members? On vacation? The fact that there were only 5 that joined her is an embarrassment. We have to step it up. The world is melting down. We have to stay focused and ignore anything that tries to divide us because they feed off of this. The right wing feeds off of it. The right wing parades with the pseudo left, the pseudo populists, because they feed off of these divisions. What is at stake right now is those who are housed. What is at stake right now are those who are losing their housing because of climate change. That is what is at stake. Food, water, and shelter, not clicks. Not who won a Twitter debate, or frankly, who won a DSA debate. I am a member of DSA. I am proud to be a member of DSA, but let me tell you something. The energy that we put into procedural motions should be put into sitting on the Capitol steps or your local Capitol steps, or following Joe Manchin around to say, end that filibuster, or following Kirsten Sinema around and saying, end that filibuster, following her to her wine retreat where she is right now and saying, end that filibuster. That is where we need to focus our energy, on the axis of power, on shaming them and making them understand, taking them to your livelihood. The fears of your livelihoods are what are going to hold them accountable. So I'm watching this screen right now as a house is engulfed in flames, as an entire neighborhood is engulfed in flames, as a highway is blocked, as many highways are blocked. And they cannot keep up with these fires. We cannot keep up with the crises that we are facing if we do not step it up. And that is what the show is going to be focused on here forward. How do we step it up? We have a wonderful show today. We have Cea Weaver here. She is a campaign coordinator for Housing Justice for All in New York City. She's from Rochester, New York originally. And she, of course, is one of the leaders around tenant organizing in New York. And a little bit later, we will have Janelle Jolley on. She's the host of What's Left to Do. Very important. We'll be talking about what is left to do. All right, stick around. We'll be right back with Cea Weaver. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. We have been talking about rent for several weeks now, nonstop, and mostly because most of us are renters, especially in New York City. I want to start off with reminding folks that the New York Times decided to prioritize asking a question about to all the mayoral candidates just a few months ago. What do you think the average cost of buying a home is in Brooklyn? And my immediate thought was, who the hell buys homes in New York City? Why aren't they asking what the average cost of rent is? But then what it did was it exposed just how ridiculous our slate of mayoral candidates were, just out of touch in that they were mostly homeowners who also didn't understand what the cost of buying a home was. Cea Weaver is well known in New York City for being a housing justice tenant organizer. She's a campaign coordinator for Housing Justice for All. She's been a campaign researcher, a tenant organizer, and a housing policy advocate in New York State for over a decade. Cea, thank you so much for joining us. You just authored a piece in Jacobin called New York's Cancel Rent Movement Isn't Over. I sure as hell hope not. So Cea, I mean, this is a New York centered topic, but I think it, a lot of folks can look to New York and say, how can we look to New York as a model and potentially learn lessons from the failures and successes of the organizing that's been done around housing justice. So I guess let's just start off with, we have keeping the Cuomo situation out. I mean, obviously it's relevant, and we will talk about that later in the show. But we have a Democratic Senate now, and a Democratic Assembly, and housing crisis, a very clear housing crisis that is inextricably linked to the real estate industry. You'd think that maybe folks would understand canceling rent, but it seems like it's polarized, the city. Can you explain why?
Yeah, I think it actually goes back a lot farther than just the last year. It goes back for decades and decades and decades and centuries. Our entire sort of country is set up around the rights of property owners and not around the right to housing. So that's probably like the foundational ideological challenge here. But shorter than that, let's start in maybe 2019. We were successful at passing very strong rent control reforms in Albany, and landlords really started organizing. I think it sort of shocked the real estate industry just as much as it shocked the political establishment. Those are the same thing, just as much as it shocked us, how much we were able to win in 2019. And we really started to see backlash right away, landlord organizing and backlash to that victory almost right away. And, cancel rent was just, I guess, a bridge too far for them, right? I think some people see it just as sort of like a polarizing rhetoric. Some people see it as like completely unrealistic. But it was a polarizing message that really activated our opposition, that conjured up images of the mom and pop landlord and really, brought people out of the woodwork to fight back against it, which was a little bit surprising.
Okay, so surprising. Why is that? I mean, real estate is so powerful that I can speak from experience. You don't talk about it in a campaign because look, I'm after you. No, but really, I mean, it is sort of like the third rail in New York City politics. So why is it surprising?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we were coming off a big victory because there is this like big Democratic supermajority, because like the tides changed relatively quickly around the question of can you accept real estate money and run for office? I think in 2020, it really felt like we had sort of turned the corner on that. It's sort of now impossible to run for office as a progressive and accept real estate money in New York. But, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And I think some of the backlash to cancel rent was really a rude awakening around that for some of us. The other thing is that cancel rent really exposes some divisions in the coalition that fought for universal rent control. For example, cancel rent is a universal program that would have provided assistance to pretty much everybody. And we were able to, when we were talking about rent reforms and reforms to rent stabilization, there was a political consensus in Albany that really no longer existed for cancel rent. It was a political consensus of liberals and progressives and socialists who all had gotten pretty comfortable with New York's rent stabilization laws. Some see them as an anti-poverty measure because the average income of a rent stabilized tenant is $40,000 a year. Some saw them as like a power building measure because rent control gives you the right to renew your lease and the right to fight for your housing, right? So that was the coalition that was fighting for rent stabilization. And that was a coalition that I think we were really used to. Cancel rent is different, right? Cancel rent is a big, non-means tested universal program that says housing is a human right. So there was a lot of, in addition to backlash from the real estate industry, there was backlash from liberals and moderates in Albany, Democrats who are like, wait a second, like why are we helping those people? And so there is a resistance to universal programs that benefit everyone in the Democratic political establishment. And I think it's short-sighted because in our efforts to make sure that the aid is going to the most needy, which is surely a laudable goal, we make the program so narrow, we make it so hard to access that people can't access it. So those very people that it's sort of perverse that those very people that you're trying to help can't get help.
I mean, you look at these statistics and they're not even completely accurate to this day of how many people haven't been able to pay their rent in the last 6 months in New York City. And it's jarring, including small businesses, by the way. So I just don't understand how they can run away from this at this point because the crisis is impending. You can kick the can down, and everybody likes to, talk about this. But if you're 2 years without paying your rent, how many New Yorkers are going to be able to afford $75,000, $80,000 up of rent? I mean, that's even public housing. If you have a 2-bedroom apartment in public housing, it's still, most likely over $1,500 a month.
Yeah.
And if you haven't been working, or if you have been working and we understand what the COVID economy has cost us as New Yorkers, but I just don't understand how even the more centrist liberals who are unwilling to, go with the slogan of cancel rent don't understand the concept of cancel rent.
Right. I think it's really interesting. I'm glad you bring up public housing. What Democrats are saying, and what the Albany establishment is saying, is that they actually have dealt with the problem. They passed something called the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It's a $2.7 billion pool of money that is designed to pay back rent for people who are eligible, so people who make 80% of the area median income or below. The problem with ERAP is that the program is incredibly difficult to get access to. It takes on average 2 hours to apply. There's no save and resume button, so you have to sit down and do it. You have to upload all your documents. You have to include photo IDs for everyone who lives in your household, including children. And the website is constantly crashing. And this sort of scenario, this sort of like program that we can't access. I mean, like, this was supposed to be the pragmatic alternative to cancel rent, right? That we are going to create a pretty standard voucher-based rental assistance program that's paying the back rent that's accumulated over COVID-19. It's not working, right? So it's crazy that like the simple solution, cancel rent, where landlords are just going to apply for the aid directly and go get it, would have probably been a hell of a lot easier, at least that's what I think, than what they did instead, which is a sort of Byzantine bureaucratic nightmare. You can't even get to the website. So it's sad. But public housing, I think, is a little, and I think you're absolutely right. It's not just that the back rent that's accumulated. The back rent is, of course, accumulated, but it's also that people aren't working moving forward either. So even if your job comes back tomorrow, how are you going to get the $75K to pay what came before and then pay the rent moving forward, right? Like we're in a more permanent recession, and we need permanent housing programs that can really grapple with the recession that we're in right now. Public housing, in public housing, people pay 30% of their income in rent no matter what. And the government is supposed to fund the difference between that and the operating. The problem with public housing is that, it's been divested in for so many years. So when the rents go down, which they have done because of COVID-19, rent collection has gone down dramatically. There's been no increase in funding from the federal government to make up for that loss in rent and make up for the 40 years of backlog and capital repairs that the agency desperately needs. And so, housing is not free. Money has to come from somewhere, and it has to come from the federal government.
I'm like really struggling with understanding why big real estate is fighting this so hard. We talked about Christopher's today about who's the author of Rentier, Capitalism, and talked about the monopolies and the monopolies taking advantage of the smaller landlords. But is it just about sort of this sort of disaster capitalism approach to the economy? I mean, what they need renters, and if people are evicted, like who's going to rent? And also, just adding to that, for folks who don't live in New York, the amount of effort, even with the new reforms that have been passed and then reversed in some cases. It's really hard to qualify for rent. If you have a red mark on your record, good luck getting a lease after this economy. So what is their forward? Who are going to be the renters if everyone's evicted?
Very good question. I think it's about power, right? I think, like everything, it's about power. It's about a sort of like deep ideological commitment to property rights. And even when it's not in their economic best interest, what they want to do is pursue eviction because it's like your property right is like inalienable. I don't know how to say it. You know what I mean? People, they don't want it to be taken away from them. And so there's just like, it's a real power. It's about exerting power over the tenant. It's my property. You don't get to stay there. It's not your house. It's my building. And even though that's against their economic self-interest, that is what they want to do. And we see it time and time again.
So, all right, we do have this little crisis happening in New York right now about who is the next governor going to be if Cuomo steps down, which is likely to happen, and our Kathy Hochul from Western New York will likely become at least the interim governor until the next election. Okay, with all that being said, the dynamics in Albany are always very, very, very important for these kinds of conversations. Do you see, just given the potential, I mean, even the weakness of Governor Cuomo, like forget about whether or not he's out of office or not. Do you see this as an opportunity? Like, is there a wedge moment to come in and say, you've created this monster, especially in light of the national conversation about the eviction moratorium that Cori Bush has been praised for really fighting to extend? I mean, is there like sort of a moment where we can, come back and flip this around?
I mean, I hope so. I always believe that there's a moment, especially when people are organizing to the degree that renters are organizing. It's important when we think about Andrew Cuomo to think about who hasn't called for his resignation, and that is, of course, REBNY. They're one of the only major political players that hasn't. And
what is REBNY? Real Estate
Board of New York. Yeah. So real estate is sticking with the governor. And so I think both this moment that we're in right now with the eviction moratorium about to expire, but also the next 6 to 8 months where there will be a gubernatorial election, no matter what, whether he's impeached, whether he steps down, whether he decides to run for re-election, there is an election happening. And the election is going to be about Cuomo's legacy. And it's going to be about whether or not it's going to be candidates distancing themselves from Cuomo's legacy. So his legacy is very simple and straightforward to me. It is gentrification. It's giving away massive corporate tax breaks to developers like of Hudson Yards, of Buffalo Billions, these like big corrupt real estate projects where Governor Cuomo is just handing the keys to develop the state to his real estate donors. That his legacy is that 92,000 New Yorkers are homeless, a number that's gone up by 50% since he took office, right? So this is who he is. And of course, he's also, all the sexual harassment, all of that too. And so what we are going to be saying to candidates and to both, the remaining leadership in Albany, Andre Stewart Cousins and Carl Hastie, who now have a tremendous amount of power.
The assembly leader and the Senate majority leader. Yeah.
The assembly leader and the state Senate leader. We're going to be saying, do you want to continue Cuomo's legacy of failed housing policies, or do you want to do something different? We've been successful in that in the past. That's how we've been able to get anything done in Albany. So if anything, the strategy is almost more possible right now.
I'd be reluctant to say they're also like because New York City there's the appearance of progressivism, at least in the city council, but there's this sort of game that happens, as we know really well, with progressives or people who want to appear progressive or have coalitions of progressives because of, living in New York City. There are a lot of folks who've come out and said like, okay, I'm no longer taking real estate money. And they have in the past, or they voted with real estate or both, or they say they've no longer taken real estate and they're still taking it. So why is that important? And to me, it's just, this was so infuriating during the mayoral race. I almost lost my mind, but this is so common. And I feel like it's become even more common after 2016 because New Yorkers are see where the tides are going and how things are shifting. But do you think it's going to be as common now with Eric Adams, at least trying to message that, New York is not as progressive as maybe the world thinks, whether or not you and I agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, look, Eric Adams is not trying to be a progressive and he's not trying to challenge real estate. That's pretty clear. I don't know. I think the fact that people change their mind about taking real estate money, or that people are willing to say that they're not doing it, but really they are doing it, all of that is just us being victims of our own success. I don't really know two ways around that. Honestly, like, people are going to lie. Politicians are going to bifurcate. That's what they do. Politicians are going to obfuscate. That's what they do. Like, that's just like a reality of the field and the work that we're in as organizers and activists. Our role is and advocates, our role is to like call that out when we see it, build enough power so that it's harder and harder to be fake. But I really see the fact that, like, it used to be just like a fringe demand. Like, that's freaking crazy. You can't run for governor without real estate money. You can't run for state senate without real estate money. It became like a necessary thing. So all of that, it drives me crazy too. And it's like infuriating. And it's like, yes, you are taking real estate money. Like, stop lying. But, we're victims of our own success. And the only solution is to like keep our eyes on the prize, keep organizing, keep building power, keep calling out the bullshit when you see the bullshit. Keep, running real people, homegrown, like progressive grassroots leaders for office, and keep changing the tide. So it annoys me, but I don't know if there's anything that we can do about it.
All right. What are your immediate demands? Your personal immediate demands?
Well, the immediate thing that we need right now is to extend the eviction moratorium. We're calling for the eviction moratorium to be extended until June of 2022. The federal moratorium has been extended, but it's just not as strong as the one that we have in New York. We want to keep our New York moratorium intact. In part because no rental assistance money has gotten out the door. So that's like our second demand is we need to get that money in the hands of the people who need it. And then we need more of it. Beyond that, we want permanent eviction protection. So we need to pass the good cause eviction bill at the state level, as well as permanent rental assistance for people who have lost their jobs and their income. Sort of, I feel like I just said the word permanent 100 times, but permanently because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we actually need we know that the way to survive crises like these are to like double down on safety net programs, not to like make them more and more temporary. So that's what we're demanding.
If folks want to help out in New York, what can they do?
Well, we've got a lot of upcoming events. So on August 10th, we are going to be having a rally in downtown Manhattan at 250 Broadway. And we're doing the same thing on August 11th and then on August 19th. So we've got like 3 upcoming rallies. You can call your state legislature and demand that they go back into session, not just to impeach the governor, but also to extend the eviction moratorium. And we're having like a party and a celebration and a sort of like honoring of our work too, as Housing Justice for All on September 9th. So that's going to be somewhere in New York City. I don't have a location yet, but our upcoming events, and you can check them all out on our social media, Twitter, Housing for All NY, Facebook, or you can sign up for our mailing list.
Go check it out. Cea Weaver, thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you for having me.
Keep up the amazing work. Hope to see you again soon.
Talk to you soon.
Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. I am very excited. Our first time, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have Janelle Jolley on for the first time on the Nomiki Show. She's the host of What's Left to Do, an East Coaster in exile living in California. This is perfect because I've once lived in California and I live in New York.
There we go. It's switch places.
So the conversation today is perfect because both of us understand, New York politics for the most part and California politics. So, all right. Governor Cuomo.
Oh, dear.
Who I have been personally reporting on and invested in challenging for probably a decade at this point. Any second now, by the time this show airs, he could potentially have stepped down. We don't know for sure.
Okay, so here we go.
Let's do it. Go for it.
By rights, he would have to be, what was you guys, AG, who had to step down, the sheriff of Wall Street. By rights, he would have to be like
Elliot
disposed with Spitzer. Yes, thank you. I was going to say Schneiderman, but I knew that wasn't right. by rights, he should.
Oh, that one too, by the way. That was also another.
Yeah,
Spencer
right,
was governor,
year.
but Spencer was also AG. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
There's so many guys. Come
yeah,
on.
that's right. New York just keeps the hits coming. By rights, he'd be disposed of that quickly, but y'all got a thug on your hands, and he's not going quietly. He's not going gently. And if we're being honest, I think it's a coin flip as to whether or not he won't serve out the rest of his term at all. I think that, you can't even say a normal politician, because what does that mean? But he's so thoroughly consolidated power in New York that I think the time that he's been given right now between like the AG's report, James's report coming out, and potentially when the House would have to start their process for impeachment, should he just not resign, that gives him way too much time to do what he does. And he's got enough juice to call in threats, just like when you guys tried to get Sheldon Silver a couple of years ago. Like, he eventually went down, but it wasn't a given, and it wasn't swift, and it wasn't right away. So I personally think that he might be able to maneuver, kind of like your boy down in Virginia who got caught in the blackface scheme, and everyone was calling for his resignation. He's still the governor. So I don't think
like the president.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I read that guy too.
That's right.
A little bit more relatable.
Yeah, that's right.
You bring up a really great point, because I think folks, and some of it is intentional to keep forces putting pressure, and some of it is just, frankly, naivete. Power, when you control power, when you control a budget, when people are dependent on you for their jobs. So in instance of Biden,
mm-hmm.
He was partly untouchable because he was the front runner, and folks knew if they could get him and beat Trump, then listen, just ignore it, just power through it.
Yeah. With
Governor Cuomo, he has used the power of the purse, the budget, to prolong this crisis. But he's made so many enemies in the state legislature. And frankly, in my opinion, we wouldn't even be at this point if the IDC hadn't been beaten by, a coalition of forces, leftist forces. But full credit to the Senate Majority Leader and the Deputy Leader, Stuart Cousins and Janaris, for really orchestrating and organizing much of that behind the scenes. And so I say that because what's happened now is Andrew Cuomo, as of last night, his own chair of the Democratic Party, which is his party. When I say it's his party, no one's in that party that is not Andrew Cuomo's choice.
That's right.
They called for him to resign. So I think it's really important. And so what you just said about that time frame is like when you're shoved up against a corner.
Yep.
Okay. So say you're like on a battlefield and
Sure.
you're thinking, oh my God, the forces are coming at me. Where do I go? And there's this little like side field that you could potentially get to if you could just like rush past like maybe 4 troops.
Yeah,
but
sure.
those troops are really naive
Right.
and young. But
Right.
you're like a master general. You're like, I can get back those 4 troops and just exit through the corner.
Sure.
That's how I see Andrew Cuomo right now.
I'm not discounting your analysis of like where he is right now. I just think that I think a couple of things. I think this is not the strongest position for the Democrats in New York to be in, to be leading this inquiry with sexual harassment, when you could be going after, the nursing home deaths, when you could be going after the Tappan Zee Bridge, when you could be going after one of, many real estate, corruption, grift things that his insiders have gone to jail for, and that you could, if you still wanted to stay and like pull on those strings, it would almost certainly lead back to him. So that's one. And to that point, I think that he's kind of like noted the shifts in the political winds with regard to allegations of sexual harassment, such that Trump was able to breeze past them when he was president. Our current president was able to kind of get that buried and breeze past. And his, I thought it was really a provocative move that his lawyer earlier this week, released the report with just like
Alphonse David.
pages. Huh?
Alphonse David or I'm
it
sorry.
starts with a G.
This is a different piece of information that came out. His former lawyer, who's now the head of the HRC, staffers are asking him to step down because of his involvement in
I think her name is Glavin. It starts with a G.
Okay.
But she, kind of came out with this retort to the AG's report. And it was kind of shady because there's just like pages of different Democratic leaders, doing what he's accused of to say like, of course, what he did, is being blown up for political purposes. Look at this picture of Barack Obama with what is the Southeast Asian country? I think she was like a political prisoner in Myanmar, and she's like, trying to get away from him, and he's going in for a kiss. So I don't think it's a given that he's cornered, but I don't think that he's done for. And perhaps maybe he kind of uses his resignation as a bargaining chip to avoid conviction. But I also think he might gamble and take the chance at an impeachment because he's still got enough chips there to call in because he's in charge of so many sinecures. I'm sure in the same respect or similarly to what the dynamics were at play with Sheldon. I'm sure, there are threats that can be called in to like pull people's jobs, of family members, of friends that can create some pressure and maybe quietly move some votes to a yes, to maybe a no. Because he's nasty and he's so egotistical. Like this is his reason for living. I don't think that it's a given that he leaves. Though. Right now, there seems to be, just about everyone in New York state politics in the Democratic Party that is coming out against him. I think it's going to be a little bit more fluid dynamic than what it may seem.
I hear you, but I think that Joe Biden wouldn't have stepped up and said, I've always said on the show that when Biden says you need to step down, then it's the end. Or when Hillary, who has not said to step down. And
not yet, but they might pull that out. Yeah.
Exactly. Partly because he doesn't have the votes in the Senate for sure. He might be able to maneuver the votes in the Assembly, but I don't really know at this point if he has those cards because the budget process is over for this year.
Sure.
And so, I want to play this clip because you mentioned how he came out with this rebuttal. And a few days ago, it seems like a lifetime ago, but a few days ago, Andrew Cuomo released this montage.
It was so cringe.
For those of you who are listening on podcast, I apologize, but if you're listening on podcast, do me a favor and just try to find this video on our YouTube channel so you can watch it. But we'll play it either way. So let's play this montage defense. Oh my God, man.
Cringe.
I've been making the same gesture in public all my life. I actually learned it from my mother
Oh my God.
and from my father. It is meant to convey warmth, nothing more. Indeed, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of photos of me using the exact same gesture. I do it with everyone. Black and white, young and old, straight and LGBTQ, powerful people, friends, strangers, people who I meet on the street.
Okay, I just have to laugh. The moments of laughter specifically were around him doing Eskimo kisses with Bill Clinton, kissing the cheek of Al Gore. Here's the thing. You know what I didn't see in that? I didn't see his hand going up a state trooper's dress.
That's right. I didn't see him cupping a breast.
Exactly.
And it's also that's not the point, Andrew. Like, okay, fine, you do this with everyone. That doesn't mean that everyone likes for you to do it. And number two, what you were showing was not what was alleged by, what is it at this point? Like 12 different women? Like, come on. Don't be gross.
And also, I think he's also trying to keep it on this story rather than the U.S. attorney investigating him for the situation that happened in nursing homes, where they covered up the number of nursing home deaths.
That's right.
The book sales, the fact that
he was using state employees.
That's being investigated right now. You mentioned what had happened with his previous real estate dealings and some of in just a few years ago, folks don't even realize this. This is like pre-Cuomo sexual situation. Andrew Cuomo's circle of trust, Joe Percoco, who he called his third or second brother, was a family member. He's in prison right now.
That's right.
His circle of trust is in jail serving on corruption charges.
That's right.
He shut down a commission when he ran for office. He ran on an anti-corruption campaign because of the situations. It's crazy. But because of things like Shelley Silver, who had to step down, the assembly leader and the longtime Senate leader in New York had to step down. Alan Hevesy, who was the comptroller, had to step down, and they all went to jail.
That's right.
So he set up this commission to investigate public corruption. And guess what? As soon as it started looking into his office, he shut it down.
That's right.
So this is New York.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Janelle, though.
Can I ask a question? Why has no one in New York politics, because I'm a little bit removed, right, but I do keep my ear to the ground. Has no one in state politics in New York at all countenanced like a tighter term limit for the governor? Because the fact that absent this investigation and this, bombshell by your AG, that he could be running again for his fourth term seems a little bit absurd to me. Like, why don't we tighten that, since, New York just, seems to be prone to so much corruption with like ensconced, political leaders who just can serve forever.
Yeah, I think these are real questions. There's a lot of democracy debates over this. I mean, California put term limits in, and then folks just rotated to other positions.
Sure.
I mean, I think there are deeper conversations about what happens in terms of the power dynamics, like who are the organizations and the parties, and how are they able to facilitate those powers. I mean, before Andrew Cuomo, you had, what was it, 4 governors in like 3 years or something. I mean, it's still a machine. I think the question is, how do we keep the interests at bay?
That's right.
From my perspective.
Sure.
Real estate, for instance, is kind of the topic of the show this week. And real estate, has not abandoned Andrew Cuomo right now because they know very well.
He's the one who's keeping them afloat in the state. There was, what is it? You guys got the LED factory that's sitting empty. You almost had, this boondoggle of a new stadium in Syracuse. God knows everything that's going on in the city for real estate people. So yeah, he's the one keeping them fed. So no, they're not going to abandon their man, like, ever. Because I wouldn't bite the hand that feeds me. So
I'm really curious to see what Kathy Hochul kind of meetings she's having right now with real estate. She was one of the more conservative congressional members out of Western New York. I grew up in her district, strangely enough, and so I'm very familiar with her. But it'll be she might be more. Will things shift? Probably not, but is she more vulnerable to defeat? Possibly. Who knows? Okay. So I want to relate this to what's happening in California, which you're really familiar with. There's this recall effort against Gavin Newsom, who is charming, who ran for governor and said he was supporting Medicare for all. He was supported by the National Nurses Union, which is a very progressive union. So what is this recall situation right now?
Okay, I'm going to try and do this without having a stroke because it's so absurd. Okay, so just if we take a step back, from my view, right now, what's going on in California, just recall-a-palooza, that is the well-organized and focused, the result of a well-organized, focused conservative movement who is taking, the pandemic, the shock of the pandemic, to try and instantiate all of these political challenges from the local level on up to Gavin Newsom. I just interviewed this week Chesa Boudin, who is the DA for San Francisco. And I believe he said the number is that right now, and he's under a recall pressure, but they're not.
Really? Chesa is?
Oh, we're going to get to that. The word is absurd. I won't be able to, I can't find another word for that. But he was saying, I think at this moment, there are over 60, I believe he said the number was 66, various recall efforts, throughout the state from local on up to Gavin. So, conservatives are using this moment of the shock of the pandemic to, kind of astroturf the anger, the desperation, the fear of people, against democratically elected officials. So that's the context. Regarding Gavin specifically, we'll start at the top now and work our way down. It's clear, again, that recalls are the only way that Republicans can win statewide office in California, because California is basically a one-party state. Now, from my view on the ground, I live in the Bay Area. Gavin, it's a coin flip at this point as to whether Gavin will beat this recall effort, which he should be able to run away with it. And the reason that it's a coin flip at this point is that the election is the election is September 14th, which is like an off-brand time to be having an election. People typically aren't paying attention to elections, not in November, definitely not in off years. So there's that compounding factor. But then also on top of this, like, homeboy isn't campaigning. I haven't gotten one phone call. I haven't had my door knocked on. I haven't gotten one mailer. I get some of his ashy ass little emails. But he's not campaigning, and no one, like Democrats, across the spectrum that, I'm in contact with, they aren't thinking about this. So, and ballots are going to be hitting mailboxes in a couple of weeks, like mid-August. And, they might look like, spam or I don't know, something unimportant. So, they're going to be headed to the trash can, because what is this thing? Surely I'm not getting a ballot for an actual election in August. So it's just a mess. And if he loses this recall, which he very well might, it won't be largely due to policy or politics. It will be due to sheer incompetence. For an example, the people who are running his recall campaign are like the same people that Kamala used for her campaign, which, we'll just leave that there. But like, they weren't even like, you have one job as campaign staff, like, and they couldn't even get him. They messed up the paperwork or missed the deadline, something. And he's not even on the ballot listed as a Democrat. And it's just like, what are you being paid for? It's just a comedy of errors. So Gavin very well might lose this recall because he's not campaigning. And I think it's just, I don't know if it's hubris or what that doesn't have him out here like making the case for himself to at least, and this is from a leftist who I have zero love for Gavin Newsom, but I do not support the recall effort because this is just a naked power grab from Republicans. But at least come out there just, and use your bully pulpit to like get people to stick with you just for the sake of democracy. Like, if you really don't like him and you really want him gone, next year is an election year, and you can challenge me. You can challenge my my seat for the governor next year in 2022 when I'm up for re-election. But to try and steal this in an off year and in this way is, you could easily paint that as anti-democratic. But again, I don't know where homeboy is. I don't know if he thinks that, working people who are trying to put their lives back together after, the calamitous year that 2020 was for so many people. I don't know if he just figures that everyone is like, buried in newspapers every day and definitely knows that this is happening and when it's happening or what, but it's been shocking to see that we're basically a month out, and in the Bay Area anyway, like nothing. So we'll see, but he's very likely to lose.
I think one question I have just before we wrap is, what's so interesting to me about this is Republicans are using this as an organizing opportunity to rebuild the Republican Party.
Yep.
So they're putting the money into organizing on the ground. And, Gavin Newsom, it seems like a very strategic move, whether it works or doesn't is a huge gamble to just ignore, maybe not to inflame it, not to ignite people, not to get national press, especially since they're pushing a celebrity, Chris Jenner. What's his name? What's her name?
Chris.
I tried. Because there's so many of them. I can't keep up with them. Caitlyn, thank you. Caitlyn Jenner.
There's a YouTube. YouTube real estate influencer who's like kind of high in the polls, and there's this conservative like radio guy who's high in the polls, and it's and I mean what I have some arguments that I've heard from fellow leftists is that we don't fuck with Gavin, do we care, and it's just like, no, we don't fuck with Gavin, like absolutely not. But because similar to New York, the governor in California sets the budget, and even though this person maybe would only be in office for a year because next year is the election year, a lot of damage can be done in a year in a state this big with this much money on the line. So, stick with the devil, and also maybe use this opportunity to pressure him to pressure him for support for AB 1400, which Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who I also interviewed, wrote, and he'll be representing that when they're back in session in Sacramento in January. So it's like we can. He's depending on our support and depending on us, like campaign for him, which really makes me angry. So it's like use this time to pressure him for Medicare for all, our version of Medicare for all in California. Use this to pressure him to support the social housing bills that Assemblymember Alex Lee, who I just interviewed, and that'll also be coming out the day next week with Chess's interview. Like, use this moment to pressure him to make good on his faux progressive ideals if he wants our support to make it through this nonsense recall effort. But I am flabbergasted at the level of unseriousness that I see his campaign approaching this recall effort with, because the thing that makes it like frightening is that if enough people vote yes on the first question, meaning like yes, he should be recalled, the person that gets just a mere plurality of votes, and I think there are over 20 people running for governor to replace him, someone could win with like 20% of the vote. And that's in a race that's going to have miserably low turnout. So that to me is just reeks of, being anti-democratic. But he, from my view, doesn't seem to be taking this seriously at all. And it's absurd.
He's been damaged by how he responded during the pandemic, showing up at elitist dinners and fundraisers. And so even if someone doesn't vote for a Caitlyn Jenner or a right-wing radio show host, they could put their vote somewhere else and decrease his vote so that the others are empowered.
Exactly.
Janelle, so interesting. Would love to have you back on. Let's have more conversations about this. Really, we have to pay attention to state level, even if, like you said, even if we're not allies with folks like this. I mean, the Republicans are really waging a war in California because they see an opportunity to keep part of California alive and also win some House seats back.
Well, and fuck up school boards like this. The San Francisco school board is under recall because that's the last major local school board that's not a charter school district. They're trying to jam my man up, Cea, at the DA because he's taking, he's threatening the profits of billionaires that are, exploiting 1099 workers. That they're astroturfing the fear that people have during the pandemic because actually they're upset about having their profits threatened. So they're organized and they're focused. The good news is that we have a level of organization and messaging such that many of these efforts won't be successful, I think, or hope. I'm knocking on wood. But they're vicious and they're using
They took over the elections for SEIU 1099, largest in the country in California, and a right-wing guy took over. That's right. Because they manipulated the membership. Yeah. Anyways, Janelle, Thank you. Super fascinating conversation.
Yeah,
Let's do this again very soon.
Yes.
Stay well, be safe.
Yes, you stay safe too. And I can't wait to meet you when I'm in New York to get you on the show. I think it'll be great. But this is such a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Go check out Janelle Jolley. She has a podcast out. It is called What's Left to Do. I love that. It's like the perfect title. My God.
Yes, it was. I was very happy when my friends helped me come up with a name. So really great. But what's left to do.com. And there are wonderful stories from people from all across the left. And I think you'll dig it. I'm a really good interviewer.
She's a great guest. So Janelle, thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, you know, I love CBD. I specifically love Sunset Lake CBD because Sunset Lake CBD is a farmer-owned company that shifts craft CBD products directly from their farm in Vermont to your door. Sunset Lake CBD has all types of products. They have tinctures, they have creams, they have gummies and fudge and salves, and of course, their hemp, which they grow on a farm that they flipped from being a Ben & Jerry's farm in Vermont to being a premium hemp farm. And it really shows. What they are doing is they are enhancing rural economies. In Vermont, they are paying a minimum wage of $15 an hour, and the majority of their company is owned by their employees. On top of all that, they support shows like ours, The Majority Report, and The David Pakman Show, which is a pretty big deal because it's, you know, we're building our show. And so it's hard to get those big brands. And it's really lovely that you have progressives who own companies that are doing it in an ethical way, supporting other progressive media out there, which is independent media in particular. They also have dog biscuits out right now that you too can eat if you want to eat them with your dogs or maybe your cat. I don't know if cats like peanut butter or not, but you can go check that out. And you also can get 20% off of your order if you go to sunsetlakecbd.com and you type in the user code NOMI, NOMI, 20% off of your entire order if you go to sunsetlakecbd.com. I can tell you, I talk about this all the time because I'm an old woman. I have sciatica. Last night in the middle of the night, I woke up with such pain in my hip because I've not been doing my yoga. And I took some tincture, I put it in my water, and it immediately calm me down. And I could go back to sleep. It makes a huge difference. It really does help me with my aches and my pains. And I know it helps out other folks. My family members use their products. My friends use their products. I use their products. sunsetlakecbd.com. It's the real deal. I wouldn't say otherwise. Okay, guys, we're doing something a little special today on Friday. This is a special segment because, as many of you know, we have a book club, and our book club, we've been sending out books for the last several months, and we have been able to do interviews with several of our book club authors when they're available. And this one in particular is very timely, especially with the show today where we had Cea Weaver on. We did an interview for the book club with the author of Rentier, Capitalism, Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It. This interview is with Brett Christophers. It is an audio version available exclusively early to our book club members at the Nomiki Show Book Club. But we wanted to feature part of it on the show today to give you guys a taste of what we offer. Of course, if you are a book club member, you also receive the book. And there's different programs available. So go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. You can receive 1 book, 2 books, or 4 books a month. And of course, if you have any questions about that, please email us at thenomikishow@gmail.com. In the meantime, I'm just going to do an extra plug. If you're not already a patron, this is the time to do so. Join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. We have other swag available too. So if you become a patron, you might be able to get a mug or a bag or some stickers or all of those things. And we're going to be doing some other fun stuff coming soon. So you definitely want to go check us out there at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. And here is our interview with Brett Christophers. Hello, Nomiki Show Book Club members. We are very excited to have this extremely timely, valuable conversation about rent. Oh, yes. I'd say the majority of our listeners are renters, including myself. And it has been a constant frustration, stress. And of course, it has been the topic of this week with Cori Bush and other members of the Progressive Caucus and the Squad who have staged an occupation basically on the Capitol steps to urge the Democratic president to extend a rent moratorium as we are about to undergo potentially more lockdowns. Crazy. We are very honored to have Brett Christophers here. He is the author of Rentier, Capitalism, Who Owns the Economy and Who Pays for It? He is also an economic geographer at the Uppsala University in Sweden. And previously, he authored the book, The New Enclosure, which won the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize. But for our book club listeners, you've most likely either received the book or read the book, hopefully. But this is sort of a special addition to our book club, is having conversations with the authors of our book club choices. So, Brett, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
When you began writing this book, did you have a sense of how bad it would get for renters worldwide, especially in the Western world, I would say? How bad it would get so quickly?
I guess so. I mean, probably the most useful place to start would be to kind of step back really briefly to talk a little bit about the book that came before, which was The New Enclosure. So that book was about the privatization of land, including but not only land for housing, in the UK context specifically over the last 30 or 40 years. And one of the arguments of the book was that instead of turning the UK into kind of a nation of homeowners in the way that was argued by Margaret Thatcher at the beginning of that program of privatization, what's ultimately happened for a series of different reasons is that land, and in particular housing land that was previously owned by the state, by municipalities and so on in the UK, has ultimately in large part ended up in the private rental sector. And so what you've had there is the growth of this kind of small landlord class, but also professional landlords who are able to extract increasing amounts of housing rent from renters across the UK. And that's been allied for a series of different reasons to massive growth in house prices and growing unaffordability, and hence a growing renting population. So the first part of the answer is yes, because of that background work. But I guess the second thing I want to say is that the new book, the Rentier Capitalism book, kind of grew out of that first book. And what I mean by that was what I noticed was that what we were seeing specifically in the context of property and housing, this divergence between an asset owning class on the one hand and a renting class on the other that pays rent to the former, that actually the economy more broadly within the UK, but not only within the UK, kind of replicates that model. So across a whole series of other sectors, including things like intellectual property, natural resources, minerals and oil and gas, infrastructure of various types, across all these different sectors, you kind of had the same model where you have, on the one hand, a private constituency of both companies and households, but in particular companies that own those assets, those valuable, scarce assets. And on the other hand, you have the rest of society paying rent in one form or another, even if it's not always called rent, to those asset owners. And so that was kind of the genesis of the book, was this kind of realization that the housing model is kind of replicated throughout the economy in all these different other sectors.
I think most people who live in major cities in the westernized world today would say rent is not keeping at pace with pay, and they're, especially as we're in the midst of COVID and potentially other Delta variant lockdowns, who knows what's going to happen. It's not sustainable, and this came to fold this week in the U.S. where it didn't make sense politically. It doesn't seem to make sense that you don't extend a rent moratorium, and simultaneously, a lot of these whether it's big, it depends on what city you're in, but whether they're landlords or big developers, they have all been given their own moratoriums or erase any of their mortgages that they've had to pay. I mean, they've been prioritized over the renters, but at the same time, people haven't been, they've lost their jobs and wages are extraordinarily low. So how is it sustainable for the landlord? I mean, basic economics would say it's not going to work.
The only reason it's sustainable for the landlord, I think, is that landlords across the board, both if you're thinking in terms of kind of the big professional landlords, but also, the kind of classic mom and pop investor landlord, to the extent that they have been borrowing in order to acquire property that is then rented out. For the past 6, 7, 8 years, they've been able to borrow at rock bottom interest rates, right? They're, in the country where I'm in Sweden, interest rates for property are around, 1.5% at the moment. And so, it's not free, but it's almost free money. So I think while interest rates remain very low, the business model broadly continues to work for landlords. Even if the people who are ultimately paying those rents are coming under increasing pressure. So I think a lot of it is to do with interest rates. And of course, interest rates are significant for other reasons, which is that, interest rates being so low is what has enabled people to, households to continue to buy housing, even though it's become more and more expensive and more unaffordable. So I think the broader macroeconomic environment is hugely important in all of this.
So does this lead to a bubble? I mean, are we finding ourselves in a different version of the 2008, 2009 housing crisis? Is this sustainable?
I think the reality is that we probably are in theoretical terms. I think it's unarguable that were interest rates to increase substantially across those Western societies which have seen the biggest house price increases, including the UK, the US, Canada, certainly Australia and New Zealand, but also within continental Europe. Sweden's seen one of the biggest increases in house prices of all. If you saw sustained increases in interest rates across those countries, I think it's unavoidable that you would see a significant shaking out in the housing market. You would see people defaulting on mortgages. You'd see foreclosures increasing in the same way that you did in the US between 2009 and 2012. So I think the question there, though, is what central banks are going to do about that. And if you read between the lines, in fact, you don't always have to just read between the lines. It's pretty obvious that house prices are a big concern for central banks these days. And one of the things that I think that will make them hesitate to increase interest rates is precisely this concern that doing so could have a big negative impact on the housing market. But certainly on paper, the concerns, there's every reason to be just as concerned as back in 2006, 2007, for sure.
Is this an opportunity for larger landlords, the big developer corporation types, to seize in on the smaller landlords, the mom and pop landlords, I guess you would call them?
I think that's happening already. If you look at big institutional investors, big asset managers, housing over the last decade or so has become one of their preferred asset classes around the world, and not just in the US and Canada, but across much of Europe and Japan and China as well. And I think the interesting story there is that around 2011, 12, 13, 14, what those big institutional investors were buying into was the fact that housing was so cheap. There'd been this massive house price crash in the US, and the big investors could go into Phoenix, they could go into Seattle, they could go into other cities across the US, they could go into Los Angeles and buy housing that was 40 or even 50% cheaper than it had been just 3 or 4 years previously. So they were buying in. Within the industry, they call that buying into distress. So that's what was happening back then. But what they then found was that even when the market recovered across much of the US and other places, what they realized was they could buy housing that was not necessarily as cheap as it had been, but they could make money in other ways. And the principal way in which they could make money was by lifting rents. And they saw all sorts of different opportunities to do that. One of it was the fact that because of the housing crisis, the supply of new housing fell dramatically. And so what you had in lots of cities was supply shortages, buoyant demand for rental housing, but a lack of new supply of rental housing, which literally just pushes rents up. So that was what investors were buying into in the latter half of the 2010 decade. And I think that's what they're buying into today. But for sure, if there was another house price crash, those same investors would be sitting and waiting, ready to snap up properties that households and smaller investors were forced to relinquish.
How do I think folks who live in cities like London and San Francisco, New York, and Miami are very familiar with, this oligarch, I guess you could say. Obviously, it's more than oligarchs, but folks who are using cash to buy properties. And 2 or 3 years ago in New York, the majority of properties being bought in New York were being purchased by foreign folks who were using it as their safe bank accounts. And of course, that affects the cost of living in the city, everything from the incentives for developers to not pay taxes. There's a whole ecosystem that's built around it. How is that playing into this economy, especially post-COVID? I mean, is there, with the crisis of housing, I mean, do you see folks are willing to address this? Leadership in different countries are willing to really take it on?
I can't speak for the US case. I think
I can. They're not. Don't worry.
Okay. Well, there you go. I think in a couple of other cases, I think governments have done something. So both in the UK and in the New Zealand cases, which are both historically territories with very rapid house price inflation, governments have taken measures to try to reduce the purchase of housing by foreign buyers for the types of purposes you're talking about, the kind of safety deposit box strategy of housing acquisition. So, for example, in the UK now, in the UK, you typically pay a tax called a stamp duty tax, which is basically a land tax when you buy housing, and the rates of stamp duty that are charged in the UK now to foreign buyers, and in particular to foreign corporate buyers, are much, much higher than they are for domestic individuals. And New Zealand's done something similar, I think. But the problem, right, is that it hasn't really had much of an impact. And I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is the fact that, lots of these foreign buyers are so wealthy that a tax of 10, 12% or whatever it might be, or typically less than that, really has no impact. It can be it can be absorbed because of the amount of capital that's available is so significant. And then the other thing is the COVID situation, which has really entailed two things in a country like the UK. So the first is that lots of those people who are in the market for buying property and able to buy property have not been greatly affected economically by COVID. Their incomes haven't gone down, but their expenditure has gone down. And so money that they've not been spending on holidays or conspicuous consumption of other types has been ploughed into the property market. And the other thing is that governments, including in the UK, have kind of poured fuel on the house price fire by taking measures during COVID, which for most buyers probably weren't even necessary. So they essentially introduced a stamp duty holiday in the UK for most categories of domestic buyers. And so people rushed to put even more money into the property market before those stamp duty rates returned to their normal levels. And so for all those reasons, you've seen this, absurd inflation in property prices in countries such as the UK and New Zealand and Sweden during COVID, which nobody would have anticipated at the outset of the crisis.
I'm glad they brought that up, because this has been happening in regions around the world, states in the US, territories in the US, but also regions in Europe that are warmer weathered, where you see, especially those who've experienced austerity, whether it's Italy, Portugal, Greece, there are all these tax incentives, Puerto Rico, in the United States. How is the housing market going to be affected in that capacity? I know that it's a little bit different, still Western more or less, but folks, just to break it down for people who may not be aware, a lot of people wanted to go to warmer weather during COVID, stay outside, stay healthy, be somewhere. I think a lot of people realized that they could work from warmer climates. And as a result, there was an incredible buy-up of land and property in a lot of these regions, especially since they're more affordable. And, I'm in Greece right now. The neighborhood I'm in, I was shocked when I got here. I had no sense that there had been a roundup of properties here. I wasn't even aware that people wanted to live in this neighborhood, to be honest. But learning from neighbors that, most of the people who come down are from Germany, other parts of Europe. And why not? If you have strong Wi-Fi, why not live in Greece during the COVID months? So how is that affecting this rentier capitalism, for folks, especially who live under austerity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Excuse me. I mean, it's not a particular topic that the one you're talking about that I know much about, but for sure that's happening. And I think it's also happening. It's important to point out a range of geographical scales. So it doesn't just happen transnationally across borders between, say, Germany and Spain or Sweden and Spain, but it also happens within countries as well. So, within the UK, there's been all sorts of criticism about the fact that a lot of, relatively wealthy people from London have been buying up property in rural parts of the country that for them is relatively affordable, but it pushes up prices in those parts of the country, meaning that people who actually live in those areas are now unable to buy property. So in a sense, that's the same phenomenon occurring internally within countries as occurs across borders in the way that you were talking about. And I suppose, policymakers in general are loath to do things about that. There continues to be great belief in allowing capital to flow freely in the way that other factors of production aren't allowed to flow freely. And then there's also the other fact that, in countries such as Greece and certainly parts of southern Spain, the local economy is to a significant extent dominated by the real estate sector, and any kind of move to choke off the inflow of foreign capital into that real estate sector would be looked at, very negatively by the local political class. And so I think it's very unlikely to expect things to be done about that. But for sure, it has all sorts of nefarious and deleterious social consequences in those types of places.
So where do you see, especially given different governments' reluctance to really protect renters and take on, these larger monopolies that are taking advantage of renters, where do you see this going post-COVID? Is this sustainable? Is this, we talked about a bubble a few minutes earlier, but it's pretty bad right now. How much worse can it get?
Yeah. It's definitely not sustainable in the long term, but I think it would be, I think that it would be foolhardy to anticipate anything by way of significant change in policy and in kind of the general political economic outlook on housing. There's all sorts of reasons for that, but I think one that I always kind of come back to, because important. If you look at the elections and how they vote at elections, the distinction between property owners, housing owners, and non-owners, between owners and renters, is in many places incredibly stark. I know that in the last general election in the UK, the proportion of homeowners between the ages of, say, 25 and 50 who voted at the election was about double, I think I'm right in saying, the proportion of renters who actually voted. So never mind who they voted for, but renters typically don't vote anywhere as near as much as homeowners do. And that data is replicated across other territories as well. And so what that means is that politicians inevitably pander to homeowners, and the very last thing they want is any negative impact upon the well-being and wealth of homeowners. So they do everything in their power, really, to avoid any kind of negative shock to homeowner wealth in the types of societies we've been talking about.
I can't help but remember just a few months ago in New York, I don't know if you saw this news, but there was a New York City mayor's race. And there were several candidates, and the New York Times asked all of the candidates. The question, I think, was in itself a problem, but also the answers were extremely problematic. They asked the candidates, how much do you think an average home, I think it was 2-bedroom home in Brooklyn costs, and everything from like $11,000 to $4 million or $5 or $6 or $11 million came out as the answers. But my big concern was, why are they asking the mayors, the candidates for mayor of New York, how much a home costs to purchase when the majority of New Yorkers are renters? That was my biggest concern. But then the last, obviously, was the folks who are running for mayor had the former, what was it, the head of a major bank on Wall Street was the one who threw out $11,000.
Yeah, I mean, the point you talk about, you were talking about how sustainable all of this. Obviously, I know we're kind of running out of time, but one of the really important things to think about is the fact that certainly in places like the UK and the US, home ownership rates are declining pretty fast, right? So, because young people can't afford to buy, property is increasingly moving from the home ownership sector to the rental sector. And when you live in a society like the UK or the US that is kind of culturally and socially invested in the home ownership dream, the more that dream kind of begins to elude increasing proportions of people, the more that becomes politically problematic and the more housing becomes potentially a significant political issue. I think the only other thing to throw into that, of course, though, is that there's a hugely significant intergenerational issue there, which is that even if young people increasingly can't afford to buy, some can, but the ones that can are those that receive the support from their parents or from family. And so what happens is the housing market becomes a kind of a vehicle for the intergenerational transmission of class inequality. So class inequalities get passed down from one generation to the next through the housing market. And for sure, that's happening in all of these countries that we're talking about at the moment, and has been happening for years.
Not to mention just inheriting the properties. And this is, this is a major piece of conversation when we talk about the just race and class issues in America, which is a much bigger conversation in terms of the legacy of slavery. But very, very much so tied to property. But final thoughts, anything that we missed, anything that we should be keeping our eyes on, especially as we're in the middle of these fights? I think for me, one of the questions people always ask, right, is, what's the route out of this? And I think the only kind of sustainable route out in the long term is a rebalancing of tenures. And what I mean by that is that
societies need to get away from the kind of ideology of home ownership. The idea that home ownership is something that we should all aspire to, and that it's a kind of a superior way of living to renting, because it's precisely that ideology that makes people desperate to buy, and that fuels the kind of insane house price inflation that we've seen in recent years. So it's only by making renting a much more attractive tenure than it currently is that you get the desired outcomes, not only for renters, but also on the home owning side. Because by making renting a more desirable tenure, you make people less desperate to buy. And that in turn reduces the kind of inflationary pressure on home ownership that is so evident at the moment. And so I think that's the ultimate sort of goal, is to kind of get away from this ideology of home ownership. But that's a lot easier said than done.
Okay, one more final question. Was there a moment in history somewhere on the planet where that was done to the best of your imagination?
Yeah, I think where I live, Sweden, in the 1970s, 1980s, what's called tenure equality or tenure neutrality. So the idea that the tenure should be more or less equal, both culturally, but more importantly, economically, in terms of what the economic implications for households are of owning and renting. That was an explicit policy goal. And it was never realized perfectly. But I think it was realized to a significant extent. And I think it was precisely the abandoning that meant that Sweden has ended up with precisely the same types of problems as throughout the rest of the Western world in the housing market.
Cautionary tale, but also a model. Brett, thank you so much for writing this book. Very timely. Thank you for joining us today. Love to have you back on if you ever want to come on the show and discuss the state of rentier capitalism, which is a topic obviously we discuss a lot on the show. But really appreciate your work, and our audience, the folks who are part of our book club, are currently reading the book. So I'm sure they'll have lots of extra questions if you ever want to come back on.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Stay safe. Thank you to everybody for joining us today on the Nomiki Show for Femme Friday with one male. I can't believe we broke the rules today, but it was a little special segment. Thank you for your patience as I'm sitting here in an unstable power environment. The power has flickered a lot in the last few minutes. Thank you to our guests. We had Cea Weaver and Janelle Jolley, as well as Brett Christophers. And thank you to Brad, who's been putting up with the power issues for the last few weeks, as always, and Ruthie on our team, and Dorsey as well. Thank you to everyone, all of our patrons, and we will see you on Wednesday. But if you don't already have it in your calendar, go check out the committee program, which airs at 3 p.m. Eastern right here on the Nomiki Show on YouTube. And if you are subscribing to us on Twitch, you can go check out their Twitch channel as well, and their Patreon and fans at fans.fm. I believe it's the committee program. We'll have it in the information section so you can go check it out. But in the meantime, thank you to all. We're really appreciative for your patience and for your subscriptions and support and likes. Everyone who's in those chats, you're always sending the love. We adore you. In the meantime, stay in solidarity.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.